the initial intended functions of dual screens is to make everything go haywire. That seems what they do best. All right, Adam, Margaret, I think why don't we get going, and then if more people want to come in, they can always come in. All right, so good afternoon. My name is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage. Thanks for joining us for the final Virtual Histories program of 2022. Margaret Stella, who is on the Zoom call also, her little logo is AIA Baltimore, is our partner with this. And Margaret just told me before we started today that we started this Friday afternoon talk series during COVID, and we are on talk number 91, which is, I don't know, I'm having a hard time getting my head around that. So if this is your first time with us, thank you for joining us. If this is your 91st time with us, thank you for joining us. We are going to keep rolling in 2023, so stay tuned for that. All right, before I introduce today's speaker, Adam Fracchia, let me just say one housekeeping matter. If you have any questions, put them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. You can put them in there anytime. We're going to try to hold questions until the very end, and then we'll get to as many of them as we can. So I'm gonna, and then, oh, I'm sorry, one more little thing. Thank you for anybody who donated and to anybody today or did the voluntary donation in any of our 91 talks. They very much are helping us keep going here. All right, I'm gonna be brief in my introduction of Adam Fracchia, who's an archaeologist who I've known for, Adam, I'm not even sure how many years, but many years. He's gonna be talking about a project, a dig in Northampton. I think I got to know you, Adam, in West Baltimore and doing digs in Lafayette Square at the Sellers Mansion and at the Upton Mansion. And I think one of the, there are a lot of us out there who, if they had to turn back the clock, would have at least taken one archaeology class in college, if not actually majored in it and become archaeologists. If you've ever gotten to be part of a dig, it is just the most, it's just magical. That's fabulous. And I will brag for Adam that one of the things that he does is he brings that magic to the projects that I've been involved with them. And really, not only are they technical digs, but they just become exciting places. You want to spend your whole day there, which actually almost you always do, but it's a wonderful experience. So Adam, I'm going to shut up and turn it over to you to talk about what you've done up in technically still Baltimore City, right? Where even though we are squarely in Baltimore County, the Northampton Furnace site is a weird little part of the city that's north of the border. So Adam, thanks so much. I'm going to mute myself and we are all yours.
Oh, wow. Well, can you guys hear me? Perfect. All right. Thank you, Johnson. Thank you, Margaret. It was really kind words. So I want to just talk about a project we started in 2019, and it's kind of gone on a little bit since then. But it really started at the bequest of a member of the National Park Service, and it's associated with the Hampton estate and the property of the Ridgeleys. And there was an effort to kind of look at the labor, the forced labor, and the enslaved, the convicts who worked for the Ridgeleys, and trying to explore their lives and fill out the history of the Ridgeley family, but more importantly, the people who worked for the Ridgeleys, who you don't really see when you go to the Hampton House today, or the Hampton Mansion, which is now a National Historical Site just outside of Towson. All right, next slide. I'm going to kind of move through this kind of quick, and I don't know if I'm visible. I wanted John to ask me to explain. Right now, I'm actually in a car sitting outside a cave site, and I was exploring a cave site today. So this is kind of my lunch break, but I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this research. So just to orient you, like John said, the Northampton Furnace right now is basically on the edge of Loch Raven Reservoir. A portion of the furnace is actually in the reservoir. So when the reservoir was created and flooded in 1922, it actually inundated a large portion of the furnace complex. All right, but it's part of Baltimore City, part of the Loch Raven watershed, and it's actually you can visit the site via trails, and people often do. Oops. All right, next slide. Thank you. So when we think about this furnace, we have to contextualize it within the time period. So this was a colonial iron furnace that began in the 1760s, ran to the 1820s. How did the furnace start? Basically, England had a demand for iron, and it was getting most of its iron from Sweden as well as Russia. But during the periods of time, it was actually enemies with both of these countries, and so it looked to other sources, especially other cheap sources, and actually looked towards the colonies, these new colonies, for iron, for this raw material. They incentivized it and were able to actually get cheaper iron from the colonies, and so it spurred this demand for iron. You know, the fuel the English Empire. Oops, I keep trying to advance the slides here. Next. Why did they pick? Why is Northampton where it is? This is an earlier geological map from the early 20th century. But if you notice, and I know it's hard to see, all those dots in red are ore deposits. So you can see that long line that snakes through, pretty much through the center of Baltimore, going on up to Delaware. And that pretty much follows the fall line, all right, the boundary the boundary for navigable travel. All right, but it also indicates where all these ore deposits are. So there's many different iron furnaces that sprang up during the colonial era. And they actually, the colonial governments incentivized the production of iron, because it was such a lucrative trade. So if you had the means, you could actually get into this trade and make a lot of money during the colonial period. Next slide. This is just to orient you further. This is a modern day aerial of the reservoir. The site I'm talking about, a portion of it is that red dot. And this is actually a map showing some of the different mines. So iron ore mines, as well as limestone. And if you know anything about making iron, you need several things. You need iron, obviously iron ore. You need limestone, which serves as a flux. And you add limestone and it pulls impurities out of the iron. You need charcoal, you need a fuel source, and you also need labor, a lot of labor, and I'll talk about that. So you can see this is an ideal location to put a furnace, all right? And if you actually look to the upper left-hand corner, you can see those number 3 and 2, that's the Texas quarries. So just to give you a little bit more historical perspective, that's the area where the stone for the Washington Monument, or at least the bottom half of the Washington Monument in DC came from, all right? And so that's still an active limestone quarry. Go ahead. To give you a little history, so Colonel Charles Risley purchased the Northampton tract where the furnace would be located in 1745. He was a very large landowner at the time. 1761, him and his sons formed this partnership that managed the furnace. By 1762, it's in operation. After his death, Captain Charles Ridgely, his younger son, owns a third of the ironworks, and then it's in trusteeship with one of the colonel's son-in-law, Darby Lux. And oddly enough, Darby Lux actually owned, I believe it was his son owned part of the Upton Mansion, where the Upton Mansion came out of that property. All right, so the furnace operated through the colonial period up into the 1820s. The furnace, just give you some more familiarization, the furnace was a blast furnace. So it used injections of hot air through bellows to allow to get that heat, the fire hot enough to melt the iron ore and produce that iron. Once that iron was sufficiently melted and the impurities taken out, it was tapped, and they'd actually make essentially troughs in sand and run that molten iron through those troughs and allow it to cool. And you get essentially what we call pigs and sows, right? Basically the long portion being the pig, and it looks like nursing piglets or sows. The iron products that they produced cannons for the Revolution, cannonballs, pots, kettles, ovens, flat irons, pans, firebacks, a whole bunch of different iron objects. There have been several objects stamped with Northampton that have been found. There's a couple within the visitor center at Hampton and scattered throughout Baltimore. Right, and it wasn't just a furnace operation. It was a larger industrial operation. It's supplying food and wood and other raw materials for the operation of the furnace. Next. But this furnace it's not just the raw materials, it's the labor that makes this furnace possible. All right, and just some of the tasks that are necessary to keep operating this furnace. If you could go back one slide, sorry, I jump around here a little bit. If you notice, the furnace can be in continual operation. So basically, you're pouring the iron, taking the slag out from the bottom, and at the top, you're just feeding it with ore, limestone, and fuel continually. So this furnace could be in blast, essentially, continually. Okay, and they would prefer to have it in blast continually. All right, it takes a lot of energy to start it up. All right, next slide. All right, so one of the jobs is producing that fuel. So cutting wood and producing charcoal for the furnace, digging out that iron ore, and most of the deposits they're going after are fairly shallow deposits. And then you have to transport that ore, that charcoal, to the furnace. You have to go through this process, and some of this is skilled, some of this is unskilled, of turning that pig iron, that iron ore, into an actual usable iron and refining it and casting it and pulling out those impurities. And so that takes a fair amount of skill to be able to do that well. And then it's ultimately loaded onto wagons and transported down to Baltimore to go through the colonies, or essentially used as ballast and shipped back to England. All right, it was a very lucrative trade, but it involved skilled, unskilled labor, enslaved labor, and convict labor. And this is the thing with the Ridgeleys. They were very, very savvy. They were out to make a lot of money. All right, so they employed essentially indentured servants and convicts up until the Revolution. And they actually they used British soldiers who had been captured in the furnace operations. But after the war, they target loyalist properties, and they're able to seize those properties and those enslaved individuals. And when the indentured servant model falls apart, they switch over to enslaved labor. They don't use enslaved labor to begin with, because enslaved labor costs money, and if you lose your slave, you're losing that property, or so they're using people that they see as disposable, which is fairly awful, but it's how they're generating so much profit at this operation, because it's very grueling, labor intensive work. Next slide. When you think about that, that really drives home just how exploitive this operation was. So this is a picture of the Hampton Mansion, a beautiful picture of the mansion. It was big. It's bigger than Mount Vernon. It was one of the biggest buildings constructed at its time, right? But it was all built on that labor, that forced labor, all right? Basically squeezing these people. And I think this statement from one of the day books really speaks to it. So between November 1775 and December 1777, the business category of profit and loss, and that's how they're viewing this, says basically 5 servants were worked to death, all right, at the furnace. All of that is for wealth to build a building like this. All right, so they're actually essentially working these people to death to generate more profit. Next slide. So we were asked if we'd like to explore this property. Nobody had looked at this site previously with archaeology. So I was very fortunate that the University of Delaware allowed us to host a field school in 2019. We pulled from the University of Delaware students as well as students from the University of Maryland. We had 14 students. We did this in the fall of 2019 during the fall semester. So every Friday from about August to November, we had students in the field. And this is what it looked like when we began. Next slide. Our goal was to locate this landscape, the furnace. We knew where the furnace stack was, but we didn't know any of the other buildings. All right, so we had a couple historic maps to go off of and some other survey techniques. And this is the only depiction of the furnace we have. All right, and this is an 1843 map of the whole Hampton estate. All right, you can go to the next slide. And this is 20 years after the furnace is closed. And so you can see at the bottom, the old furnace is depicted, the coal house, and then essentially you have all these other buildings, which probably had to do something with the original furnace complex, but now are called the furnace farm. So it goes from the furnace to being a working farm. All right, so this is our guide for trying to figure out what the landscape looked like 20 years later, and then work back from that. Next. So what we did was try and superimpose that map on the current landscape. It was a fairly accurately drawn map. The only problem is the landscape's changed a great deal. The forests have grown back, and a large portion of the landscape has been flooded for the reservoir. So we were able to tie several features of that map to current aerial imagery. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you detail. One of the ways we did that was through what we call LiDAR. And that's basically using very accurate measurements of the ground surface so you can pick out changes in elevation. And it's able, they basically take beams of light, many beams of light, and they take so many, it actually can pierce the canopy of the trees and give you an accurate depiction of the elevation. And so using that LiDAR data and then going out to the field, we're able to pick out several structures that weren't visible because of the growth out there. And you can see we found bank barn, foundation and some wells, as well as a portion of the original coal house. And there's lots of different features. And I think Johns could talk to you about it on that landscape that eventually you can pick out when you walk through that landscape. But it's very much in the summer looks like a jungle. There's so much growth there. Next slide. The next, yeah, thanks. Just to kind of show you what it looks like. This is what it looked like when we began. It kind of looked like a tiger could jump out at you at any time. There are portions where we were walking through the grass and the grass was up to my chest. So it's the surface visibility is very poor there. Next slide. This is that other one of the things we wanted to do was look at the larger industrial landscape. It's not just a furnace. It's not just where we were looking for where people were living. It was a whole landscape geared to iron production. And so this is actually further west near Delaney Valley Road, but this was part of the complex. There were quarry pits still present. There was actually a raceway and a dam. So they dammed up this stream and used the power water wheel, which turned the bellows, injecting air into the furnace. So many of these features were visible on the landscape. And then there's other features that post-date the furnace that also show up here. Next slide. So this was a great guide for us. And then so when you know where these features are, you can kind of get through the jungle and find them. And believe it or not, the furnace dam is still present. So this dam that was being used up into the 1820s, is still out there, and you can actually see, the rise of the dam on the picture on the left. And if you actually look at the right to the left of that rise, you can see some stones. So they actually piled up stone and then put up this mound of dirt to dam up the stream and feed the raceway. Next. So one of our goals was to try and understand this industrial landscape. We also found remnants of the furnace farm, and the furnace farm was in operation all the way up until the 1920s when this land was seized by Baltimore City for the reservoir. And so there's just odd little rises and platforms and shapes out there that you can pick out. And then once you can correlate them to historic documents and excavate them, you can understand what they are. So the image on the left is part of that bank barn. You can see the rise in the back. The image on the right is actually the base, we believe, of a silo, probably dating to the 20th century. Next slide. So the furnace becomes a furnace farm and actually gets a form with somebody, you actually get depicted on the maps as the furnace farm. They move away from the stream up onto a higher portion of what's now a peninsula. They construct this beautiful home, and there's still the foundations of this home present, but this whole landscape's transitions. And so we found remnants of the farm that aren't depicted on these photos. And these are photos that actually the city took when they were condemning the property in terms of valuation. Next slide. So other features on the landscape. This is actually the furnace stack, and you can see it's actually in the reservoir now. So that's the remains of the portion of the furnace where they would be feeding it. The image on the right is the remains of what we call the bridge house, which is essentially the platform that went out to the top of that furnace. And so portions of that abutment is still there. Next slide. Other features we found, we actually had a student who stumbled into this foundation. After she found a couple of stones, we ended up clearing all of the grass, cutting the grass back, and we found this dry laid stone foundation. And what you're looking at is what we determined, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, what we believe a late 19th, early 20th century farm building, right? But those stones probably came out of some of the earlier furnace buildings, and they're reusing these stones. Next slide. So what our goal was to tell the story of those workers, reconstruct the landscape and tell the story of those workers. And I know this isn't over an aerial, so it's hard to depict what this was, but basically we were out there and we focused on this cellar hole, as well as some of the foundations we found. And we did what we call an SDP, a shovel test pit survey, which is a series of shovel-sized holes where we look at the stratigraphy of the ground, the different soil layers, as well as the artifacts found within them. And we record all that information. But it's a good way of surveying a large area fairly quickly and seeing what is there, what does the stratigraphy look like, artifactually, what's present. So our goal was to try and find houses, buildings, structures associated with the furnace workers. Where were they living on the landscape? And could we find some material evidence of their lives? Next slide. So this was that first test unit. We thought maybe this was a structure originally associated with one of those habitations. We put a test unit inside of it. Next slide. We also put test units within what we believe was a house foundation and cellar hole. Next slide. And this is that unit within that cellar hole, or within the edge of that foundation on the cellar hole. And in that foundation, we found layer going down probably about 4 to 5 feet. And it was filled with ceramics from the mid 19th century all the way back to the colonial period. And you can see kind of a hodgepodge of different artifacts that were collected. So cream wares and white wares and part of a smoking pipe, lots of buttons. It's very, very much a domestic feature. Maybe a fill layer inside the building. Next slide. Also, we're trying to look for the walls outside of that cellar. And so we put a test unit in. This test unit didn't find those walls. We found a lot of demolition debris. But we did eventually found a soil layer dating probably to the early 19th century. So probably when the furnace was in operation. And I know it's really hard to see, but you can basically see right above the floor, kind of a brown layer, and that's that layer we're talking about here. Next. There's some of the artifacts we found, and there was a very nice mix of possible industrial artifacts, lots of slag, but then also a lot of domestic material, which probably is associated with activities they're doing outside of the home. So on the left, you see a pair of sewing scissors. In the bottom center, you see a mix of ceramics going from the 1780s all the way up to probably the 1870s. So that building was probably used by the furnace, probably used by someone in charge at the furnace, and then part of probably the main building for the 19th century farm. All of these artifacts provide us a window into these different time periods at the furnace and how it transitioned and what life was like at the furnace. Next slide. One of our goals was to locate the dimensions of this building. So we didn't find it in that last test unit. So we essentially dug a 1.5 meter trench, and we dug it stratigraphically and we followed it down into that pit. And we thought we'd find the wall at the top. But basically in that picture, this is what it looked like on the left. And then at the end of excavation, when we hit that orange subsoil that hadn't been disturbed, you can see that kind of white band. We found maybe 2 or 3 courses of stone. And that's the remnants of the wall, the basement wall, the cellar wall of that structure. So it looks like when that building maybe was not being used anymore, they came in and they took all the stone out. And they robbed that building all the way to almost to the footer of that building and reused it. So that tells us something about how active they were at this landscape even after the end of the furnace. Next slide. So I went through this fairly quickly, but some of our conclusions. Well, the material and landscape record of the furnace land, this industrial landscape, and even the later farm still exists. So kind of documented that this record is out there, and we kind of just scraped the surface of this landscape. But it wasn't just the furnace site, right? It wasn't just the area around the furnace. It was a larger industrial landscape that, when you look at it, spans a huge area. So if you even wanted to think about the area they were cutting to make charcoal, you're getting many, many thousands of acres or hundreds of acres of land, right? And remnants of that industrial landscape are still preserved out by the reservoir. All right, we were able to document some of the more visible portions of that landscape. Okay. What it also showed us, the evolution of the furnace, the destruction of the furnace, the creation of the farm complex, and then the eventual collapse of the farm complex when it was seized by the city, really shows us kind of the nature of modern capitalism and that drive for profit. The drive for profit that the Ridgeleys used to gain so much wealth, and to the detriment of those convicts, the indentured servants, the later enslaved individuals, even the free wage laborers working there. Right, we see that in the landscape. We see that from the transition from convict to slave labor to eventually renting out the farm. And when we look at the census for that period from when we look at the census record from the 1850s, 1860s to the 1920s, we see essentially every 10 years or even before that, a series of people renting out the farm, and maybe even tenants working out there, and eventually becoming possibly a truck farm. But we see that lack of permanence in the landscape. So after the furnace becomes a non-viable, or the furnace doesn't get updated, they transition and they make it a farm, and they rob all of the structures for stone to create other buildings, and then they improve upon that with the picture I showed you of that larger house. And then eventually, when that falls apart, it seems that those buildings get robbed out again, and that land transitions back and is eventually used by the city as the reservoir. Some of the other conclusions we came, and this is usually what you get with any archaeological project, a whole bunch of questions. We believe, obviously, we need much more archival research. Fortunately for us, the Ridgeleys took really good notes. And so there is a large archival database out there. There's lots of Ridgeley papers that can be sorted through. And there's been a fair amount written about the Ridgeleys and even the furnace operations. But we were looking at it from the material aspect. And to pick out the structures that maybe the enslaved, the convicts, the indentured servants were living at, we need to employ other means, remote sensing technique, geophysical survey, and more systematic excavation to try and find structures that would be more ephemeral on the landscape, log structures that might not have might not have those deep cellars. But we can find those, we can possibly find those through geophysical testing and more detailed excavations. And just kind of thinking about when we're trying to study these people, not just their relationship with industrial operations, what was their life like? And this artifact really kind of spoke to it. This was essentially laying on the surface at the site. And I don't know if anybody can identify this artifact. This is actually the soundboard of a harmonica. So if you think about people's lives at the furnace, they're living at the furnace, they're working at the furnace, and, they have a life outside of the furnace too, and trying to add detail to many of these individuals who we will never know their names. All right, some of the enslaved individuals we know by their first name. Many of these other people, we don't know who they were. So this is kind of trying to fill in that history. Next slide. And this is just kind of one of the avenues we've tried to pursue. And we had Bill Stevens come out and take some aerial imagery for us, very detailed aerial imagery. And it just kind of shows how through these different sources, you can eventually pick through and begin to compose a map of what is still out there. And if you look on the bottom left, you can kind of see a rectangular square denoted by very dark lines. That's the farm outbuilding I showed you originally, which we were able to date to the late 19th, early 20th century. We actually found a 1920s nickel, which kind of corresponds to when these buildings would have been abandoned. And then the image on the right, you can see kind of a whole bunch of dark lines. It's actually the bank barn and some of the wings on the bank barn. And by just kind of kicking over a little bit of the dirt where there were stones, you can see how this feature pops out. And I know all these looks kind of confusing, but it's also showing you all these different changes in elevation. So you can see how this building was right on the bank of this road, and it was essentially a bank. It was a bank barn. But through these different means, employing these different means, we can begin to pull out the material as well as built environment history of this landscape, and begin to figure out where these workers might have been living, and kind of flesh out that history, history that's not really told in great depth at Hampton right now. And it'd be nice to kind of fill in that history. Next slide. So this came together by partnership with the City Department of Public Works, and they allowed us to be out there. We went through a whole bunch of concerns, especially since this is the water supply for Baltimore City, so try not to contaminate the water supply, and respectfully excavating at the site. We're also encouraged by the National Park Service, David Gatsby, as well as the staff at Hampton. They were more than willing to help us with historical resources and what they knew of the furnace, as well as the University of Delaware, who allowed us to host this field school, Luann DeCunzo, Sandra Werner, and we were given a small community engagement grant. And so the students did the excavation. Right after the excavation, they actually presented their work to the public at Hampton and what they had, their initial findings. Which was a great experience for them to learn how to do that, but also kind of communicate what we had found, as well as obviously Baltimore Heritage. And of course, I have to thank the students who went out in the furnace in the blazing heat in the beginning. And by the end, I think on our second to last day out there, it was snowing. So they braved the elements, they braved the ticks, they braved all kinds of things. And I think did really great archaeology. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Adam. I will say I visited the site while you all were working, and it was a gorgeous sunny September afternoon with perfect weather. So I braved nothing to go out there the one time I did. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A box. And if you are still with us and you have one, put them in. But maybe the first one is, there's a comment about going back to the stones used in the buildings. And you talked about how they were kind of reused. This question is, in 1922, when the dam was built, all or nearly all of the stones had been removed from the area. And do you know who did that or how that happened? So by the time the dam came in, there was not a lot of stone foundations left. How did that come about?
I don't know when the buildings were cleaned out. What a time period, we don't know when that happened, but we imagine once it gets condemned that especially that very large Victorian house, they probably disassembled. But we're only seeing footers, we're only seeing foundations left. So obviously somebody came in and carted that stone away. We don't have an accurate date for that. We do know via the photos what's present. But after that, we don't know. I think the building I showed you, that trench with all that orange soil, I think that was robbed out much, much earlier. The artifacts we find in that trench, even towards the bottom, date to mid 19th through maybe the third quarter of the 19th century. So there's a lot. It's not just one singular event. There's a series of transitions. They're probably robbing from that building to make something else. It's beautifully cut limestone, and so they're going to reuse it, or even mainly limestone.
Excellent. All right, we have another one to ask you to explain a little more what LiDAR is. How does it work? How do you do it? What's involved?
So LiDAR is essentially light imaging and detection, aerial reconnaissance. I don't actually remember the acronym. I'm sorry, but it's essentially the idea of 3D scanning. That you're taking very accurate measurements with the laser. So laser goes out, it hits something and bounces back, and the computer registers the time it takes to go out and come back. And the speed of light is constant, so you can measure distance that way. And so you can actually do it via drone now. They used to use aircraft, and there's actually the public can access LiDAR data for the entire state through the Maryland IMAP, I believe, webpage. I'm forgetting now. But basically, they fly a plane over, and it's sending all these beams of light down and measuring the elevation of the soil. And so you can actually get a very detailed map of minute changes in elevation. And if you put it into a program, you can actually tweak those changes and exaggerate them. So a minute little pit might pop out further. And it's a great way, in a farmer's field, kind of like I'm looking at now, you could walk it and see it, but in the forest, it's really difficult. And since there's so many beams of light coming down, they're taking so many measurements, it can get beyond even leaves in the summer. And you get a very accurate measurement of the ground surface. And you can get a drone and do this with a drone at a very small scale and even more accurate measurements. And to do that at the furnace probably would have some of these more ephemeral buildings pop out, where there might be maybe slight bumps where the foundations are still present.
Excellent. All right, I've got one more for you, and then we'll probably try to wrap up here. And I know from talking to you, and I think you mentioned a little bit how horrendous the working conditions were at the furnace. And I seem to recall there were some firsthand accounts of enslaved people trying to run away, maybe even doing drastic things just to try to get away from this environment that was so horrible. Do you mind sharing a little bit about some of the things that you found from the historical record in that regard?
Yeah, so what we have to rely on, if you think about it, is a very biased sample, right? So we're looking at what people have written about. We don't have any journals from the enslaved. We don't have any journals from the convicts or indentured servants. But we can kind of use these different sources critically and look at it. We have several instances of people trying to run away from the furnace. There's runaway ads in the paper saying, this is my enslaved, and it would say my Negro, essentially. And this is what he looked like, and this is what he was wearing. This is how tall he is, and this is what his eye color, all of these descriptive details. And usually there's a reward associated with that. So we can begin to kind of go through and see how many people are running away. We do have a couple instances where one individual actually tried to kill himself rather than work at the furnace. We have a supposed report from a doctor who refused the work there because the conditions were so abysmal. So we are getting these historical accounts of just how awful. And then even if you want to read through the day books, 5 people died from exertion. I mean, that's pretty horrendous. Archaeologically, if we got a better survey, we got a better sample, we could look at this materially and see quality of life. We looked at some of the faunal material. I had somebody from Johns Hopkins, a graduate student, look at this material, and she found that they were using, they were eating domesticated animals, obviously, but they were also using a lot of wild game. They're eating muskrat and other wild animals. And so are they trying to supplement their diet? A lot of these enslaved sites, the owner is not giving them enough food. They're exerting themselves so much. They have a very high energy load that they need to satisfy. They're working really hard. They need to eat a lot, and they're not getting enough. And so you see they're actually going out and supplementing their diet and getting kind of the resources they need on the side. And if you think about how hard these people have to work, at the iron furnace, and then they have to go out and catch their own food, it's a pretty abysmal life. And it's all of that's based on profit, which is pretty horrendous. And so I think the people have looked at some of these records before, but if somebody could go back and really flesh out this historical record. And I know Cheryl LaRoche did just finished up last couple of years the ethnographic study of the enslaved at Hampton. But really fill out the furnace portion of that would be amazing.
I lied. One tiny little quick follow-up. We just got a question about,
sure,
did the Ridgeleys or others keep a list of the names of the people who worked there? Is that do you know if that's available anywhere, or is that a question mark still?
Yeah, there are some lists of names of the people who worked there. It's not a full list. I mean, I haven't seen the list of the British soldiers who supposedly worked there, who were captured and worked there. But there are lists of some of the individuals who were there. And for the Ridgeleys who took great notes, there's a lot more than at other places. But I mean, the Ridgeleys were, I mean, one of the examples they tell you at Hampton and they show you is the Ridgeleys actually recorded that they would give Christmas gifts to the children of the enslaved children. And you see a list where they're giving things out, and then there's kids that they didn't give any gift to because they were bad. So that amount of details there. So I think looking through that data, you can pull a lot more out of that historical record. But just the idea that that is a very biased sample.
And if somebody were curious, would you go to Hampton Mansion? Is that your starting point if you wanted to kind of do a little bit more digging? Is that where you'd start?
I would say talk to the people at Hampton, and then from there you can go further. I know the records. There's papers, I believe, at the state archives, as well as the Maryland Historical Society has a huge amount of the records. Unfortunately for our project, we finished the archaeology portion when we were ready to go to do the historical research. That's when things shut down with COVID and we weren't able to actually get to the archives. So we kind of missed that window. But we could really pick up from there. I think somebody definitely could pick up from there and look at what people have written and also kind of build on that.
All right. Well, thank you, Adam. And thanks everybody for joining us. Have a good weekend, a happy holiday. And some of you, hopefully we'll see you in January. All right. Take care. We're gonna pull the plug. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
All right.